Hilchos Shmittah v'Yovel Perek Revi, the laws of the sabbatical year and the Jubilee year, chapter 4. We've talked about working the land. Today we're going to talk about what happens if the land does produce certain things during the 7th year. Maybe leftover seeds from the 6th year. Maybe it's a wild aftergrowth. What do we do with things that grow in the Shmittah year? That's the topic for today. Halacha Aleph, the Rambam begins, Kol shetoitzi ha'aretz b'shana shvius. Anything produced by the land in the 7th year, bein min hazera shanafal ba mikodim shvius, whether it's seed that fell into it from before the 7th year, bein min ha'ikrim shaniktzru mikodim v'chazru v'asu, or it's from roots that are replenishing. They were harvested before and they're reproducing. Ushnehem nikru sfiach, of which both of these cases results are called sfiach. Sfiach is a Hebrew word, loosely translated as aftergrowth. We're just going to use the word sfiach or sfichim in the plural. Whether it's just grasses or vegetables that grew wild with no seeds or roots. Biblically speaking, anything that grows on its own accord is permitted to be eaten during the 7th year biblically. Shenemar, because it says, here it is. The rest of the land, the sabbatical of the land, will be for you for eating, which means while the land is at rest, whatever it produces you can eat from. Even if a field was so thoroughly plowed, and then it grew, its fruit is permitted to be eaten. In other words, somebody might have plowed it in an improper way during Shmittah. Maybe things were actually planted during Shmittah as well. Doesn't matter. It grows on its own, it's permitted. The fact that the Torah begins earlier in the verses and says, the aftergrowth of your harvest, you shall not harvest, which would sound like you shouldn't cut or benefit from anything which grows wild, that only means it only means that you shouldn't harvest the same way that you harvest every other year. As the Rambam will elaborate a little later in the chapter, but he mentions a point over here. If you indeed harvested the way that harvesters will usually cut produce, you get lashes. For example, you went through the whole process. You harvested the entire field, you make a grain pile, you use cattle to thresh, or you harvested with the intention to enhance the work of the land, as we explained in the other days. The prohibition is only to use a professional mode of harvesting. What you're allowed to do, though, is harvest little by little for daily use or whatever you need in the moment, and beat it. Instead of threshing it professionally, you just beat it with your hands and you eat the produce. That's the biblical law. No harvesting in the fully normal way, but you certainly could eat that which grows on its own. Said the rabbis, that all sfichim are forbidden to be eaten. And why would they make a decree? Unfortunately, there were some suspect Jews, sinners. So that people shouldn't go and plant grains or legumes or garden seeds secretly in their fields. And when they grow, he'll eat them and say, you know what, it's just an aftergrowth. I didn't plant it. Meanwhile, he did purposely. Therefore, the sages forbade all sfichim that grow on Shmittah. However, if you noticed in halacha number 1, sfichim were only 2 of the categories: leftover seeds, leftover roots. But wild grasses, those are not called sfichim. And therefore, says the Rambam, Halamadata, you therefore learn, the only things that can be eaten on Shmittah are ella peiros ha'ilanos, fruits of trees, because those, of course, cannot be worked around. You can't make a trick of trees growing all of a sudden in Shmittah. Trees are either there or they're not there. So fruits of trees, if they grow wild, there's no sinner that can get it to grow in any other way. And therefore those can be eaten. And also grasses or herbs that are not typically planted by most people. Like pegam is translated as rue. It's the one on the left over here. The hayarbuzin hashaitim, and the wild yarbuzin. Yarbuzin are either sorrel, this one here, or amaranth. That's how he translates it over here. A bit of an argument in the exact definition. Point is, these are not usually planted, behind anything like them. Because they're not usually planted, there's no reason to suspect that a sinner would have planted them on his own. But any other vegetables that most people would plant in a garden, or other types of grains or legumes, anything which grows, even wild, is forbidden to be eaten rabbinically. And if somebody picks it, the rabbis will give him rabbinic lashes. What if svichim grow wild in a fallow land, a fallow field? Uvisdei nir, or in a plowed field. Uvisdei kerem, or in a vineyard. Uvisdei zera, or in a grain field. Mutarin ba'achila. These are all permitted to be eaten. The rabbi's decree did not apply to them. Why didn't the rabbi's decree about these? Because nobody actively would plant in these places. In other words, the whole underlying suspicion of the rabbis is that we're worried that a sinner is going to go and actively plant. But in these 4 places, no sinner would actively plant. Why? Sdei bur, a fallow field, a field of ruins. Ein adam nifna l'sham, nobody goes there. Sdei nir, a plowed field. Reitzahu b'tikuna, the person wants to preserve its beautiful state of being plowed. Uzdei kerem, a vineyard. Einei oisei karmai, nobody would forbid his own vineyard. We learned in the beginning of this book, if you plant vegetables or grain seeds in a vineyard, the whole thing becomes forbidden. You might be a sinner who violates Shmittah, but you're not going to violate this. Uzdei zera, and a grain field has svichim mafsidin oisa. Svichim will ruin it. And therefore nobody would actively, again, undermine his own field. V'chein ateven shel shvi is also straw that grows during Shmittah. Mutar b'chol makom v'legazru olav is permitted in all places, and the rabbis never decreed anything about it. Halacha hey svichin shel shvius sheyotzu l'meitzai shvius. Things grew wild during Shmittah, and then they were still in the ground by the time the 8th year came in. Asurin ba'achila, they're still forbidden to be eaten. Ve'ein tilshanes and bayad, and you cannot pick them by hand. You can plow as you normally do, and if those aftergrowths get uprooted, that's fine. You can put an animal in the field to pasture. If they eat up those grains or those growths, that's fine, but no picking it by hand. Until what point are wild growths of the Shmittah year forbidden all into the 8th year as well? From the beginning of the 8th year till Chanukah of the 8th year. From Chanukah and on, they're permitted. If somebody replants wild growths that grew in Shmittah, he replants them after Shmittah, hagidulin mutarim. What grows there is permitted. Halacha zayin bitzalim, sheyatzu mishvius l'meitzai shvius. Special law applies to onions. Onions that grew in Shmittah, and they went out, they exited into the 8th year. Im asu kayetze bahen mutarin. If there was enough time that regular newly planted onions can produce the same size in the 8th year as the ones that grew in the 7th year, now even the ones that grew in the 7th year are permitted. If they're not, in other words, that time hasn't elapsed yet, they're forbidden. The same metric can be applied to other fruits. We cannot buy them in the 8th year until there's enough time that they could have produced similar sized fruits fully in the 8th year. Also habakir, even if early produce becomes ripe, hutar ha'afil, the later produce also becomes permitted. In other words, you don't have to wait till the later growing fruits would produce the same size. Even if it's an early crop, that's already enough to permit the 7th year fruits. Vegetables can be bought right away on the aftermath of a Shmittah year. At what point is a person allowed to buy luf? Luf is either this, what we call the taro, or these kinds of berries. At what point can a person buy that on the year after Shmittah? Once the new produce exceeds the old. Commentaries say after Pesach of the 8th year, that's when enough new produce has grown to outdo the amount of the old produce. Halacha tes. Every time you talk about a demarcation line of a year, produce that grows in this year or grows in another year, you have to always know where is the new year beginning. So the Rambam says when it comes to Shmittah and Yovel and Jubilee years, Rosh Hashanah, the new year, is marked at the first day of Tishrei, what we celebrate today as Rosh Hashanah. And therefore, that's the crossing line when we decide if a fruit grew in the 6th year, 7th year, or the next year. Did it cross Rosh Hashanah between the 2 years? Peiris shishis shenichnesu lashviis, when we have fruits of the 6th year that entered the 7th year, im hayu tvuoi kitnios a peiris ha'ilam. If we're talking about grains or legumes or fruit of a tree, v'higiu lo einas hamaisrois kaidem Rosh Hashanah, and they reach the point of being tithed before Rosh Hashanah of the 7th year. Remember in the laws of tithing, every fruit has a stage. We call it about a third of its growth. When if you would harvest it at that point, you'd be obligated to tithe it. So the Rambam says, let's say you're in the 6th year over here, grains, and the grains reach that stage before Rosh Hashanah, Harei Elu Mutarim, they're considered produce of the 6th year, and they're totally permitted to be eaten on the 7th year. Even if you pick them during Shmittah, they had the law of 6-year fruits for all matters. But if they only reached the 3rd of their growth, after Rosh Hashanah, they're considered Harehin Kepedes Shvias. They're like fruit of the Shmittah year, have to be treated with Shmittah sanctity, as we're going to discuss in future chapters. The basic law is, when you're dealing with Shmittah fruit, if it's grains or legumes, they're going to be forbidden to be eaten because they're sfichim, they're after growths, they're wild growths, which the rabbis forbade. And the fruits of the tree will be eaten within Shmittah sanctity, again, as we'll explain in the coming chapters. Halacha Yud Aleph, special rules apply to certain species. Ha'oires, rice, v'hadoichan, and millet, v'hapragim, and poppy, v'hashumshimin, and sesame, u'poil hamitzri shezroi lezera, and the Egyptian bean, fava bean, which you planted to use the seeds, the kernels, as replanting seeds, not to eat them. In these cases, we go not after whether they reach the 3rd of their growth before Rosh Hashanah, but after the full ripening of the fruit. If the fruit was completely ripened, or the grain in this case, was completely ripened before Rosh Hashanah, they're permitted on Shmittah like fruits of the 6th year. But if they're only concluded after Rosh Hashanah, even though they took root before the new year, they are forbidden on account of being sfichim, fruit that grows during Shmittah. Halacha Yud Beis, another category, hayarak, vegetables. Vegetables, cucumbers, here we have, bishas likitasai. We follow when it's picked. We don't care about 3rd of its growth. We don't care about ripening. When was it picked? Picked in the 6th year? 6th year. Picked in the 7th year? 7th year. V'ha esreg. And an esreg, afilu hayo kapoil kaidem Rosh Hashanah, the nase kakikar bashvias, even if it was the size of a bean before the new year, and it grew to the size of a loaf during Shmittah, chayav b'maisres kepedes shishis, it's considered like the 6th year fruits in regards to the obligation of tithing. You do have to tithe it, unlike produce that grows in the 7th year, you don't have to tithe. This esrog, you do have to tithe. V'afilu haya kakikar bashishis, on the other hand, even if it was as big as a loaf during the 6th year, it fully grew. Hayil v'nilkat bashvias, as long as it was picked in the 7th year, hareu kepedes shvias, it is like fruits of the 7th year. Umisaser kepedes shishis lahachmer, it's only tithed like fruits of the 6th year to be stringent on it. So the bottom line is, esrog is kind of like vegetables in that you follow when it's picked. If it's picked in the 6th year, it's 6th year, picked in the 7th year, it's 7th year. It just has an additional stringency which you have to always tithe it as though it belongs to the 6th year. Halacha Yud Gimel v'chein peiros shvius sheyatzu lo metzai shvius. Till now we talked about fruits in the 6th year entering the 7th year. What if we go back and we talk about fruits of the 7th year entering the 8th year? Bitvu v'kitnias v'ilanais, grain, legumes, and trees. Hilchin achar einas hamaisers, we again follow the 3rd of their growth. When did they reach 3rd of their growth? In Shmittah, they're called Shmittah fruits. After Shmittah, they're called after Shmittah fruits. The other 5 species, there's poppy and the sesame and the rice and the millet and the Egyptian beans that you planted for seeds. You follow the ripening. And again, the vegetables you follow when it's picked. Halacha Yudalid, we get more into detail about the poil hamitzri, the Egyptian bean, as we once did also in the laws of Maaser Sheni, the 2nd tithe. It seems like it's a very unique bean. Much discussion about it in the Talmud. Poil hamitzri has 2 elements to the bean. There's the seeds and the greens. The greens are called yarak. They were typically used for eating. Seeds were used for replanting. So you always have to examine what's the purpose that you planted it for. And besides for knowing the purpose, you have to know what to do with both elements of the bean. So although in the previous halachas we mentioned the Egyptian bean as being one of those things which follows the ripening, the Rambam now gets more into detail about it. And he says like this. First, we're going to be dealing with this column. You planted it in year 6, and you want to know if you can eat it in year 7. So you planted it in year 6 for seeds, lezera. And its fruit fully ripens before the new year of Shmittah, in which case we said it's considered to be fruit of the 6th year. The Rambam says that applies to both elements. Bein yarak shalai, bein zera shalai mutar b'shvius, whether the greens or the seeds are permitted on Shmittah. V'im zara li yarak, what if you planted it for the greens? V'nichnasa alav shvius, even if it fully ripened before Shmittah. As long as Shmittah enters and it's still in the ground, bein yarkei, bein zarai, asr kisviche shvius, both its greens and its seeds are going to be forbidden like things that grow during Shmittah. Same thing if you planted it for both during year 6 and it enters year 7, Asr, both are forbidden. What if you planted it in year 7, which is forbidden? Uses the word avar, you transgressed, and you planted it during Shmittah, and now it exits to the 8th year. So the question is it forbidden as Shmittah fruit or not? So look at what purpose. If you planted it for seeds, whether the seeds or the greens are going to be forbidden after Shmittah, like any other thing that grew during Shmittah. But if you planted it for vegetables, and the law of vegetables is that it always follows when it's picked, as long as it's picked in 8th year, both its seed and its vegetable, its green, are going to be permitted. In this case, if you planted it for both, you divide it. The seeds follow the laws of seeds, and since they ripened before the Shemitah year was over, they're considered forbidden like svichim. The greens are considered vegetables, and they're permitted since they're picked after Shemitah year. Halacha tazayin b'nois shuach, white figs. Since they usually ripen after 3 years, think about this. If they reached the third of their growth on Shmittah before the new year of the 8th year, you'll have a scenario where 2 years later, the 2nd year into the next agricultural cycle, those white figs, which are going to now finish ripening, are going to be picked now, but they reach the third of their growth in Shmittah, they're going to have to be treated with Shemitah sanctity 2 years later, because it's all about when it reached the third of the growth. Yud Zayin habitzalim hasarisim, special, what's called impotent onions. They don't produce scallions. If you leave them out, usually onions will begin to grow these green growths. The sarisim onions, they don't grow such things. Upayla mitzri, same thing, the Egyptian bean. Shemana mehem mayim shleishim yoyim kaidem l'shashana, which you withheld water from them 30 days before the new year. Farmers, before they knew they wanted to pick something, they would stop watering them so that it would a little bit dry out and be ready for harvest. So you stop watering it a month before Rosh Hashanah. B'shel Baal shemana mehem shalish oynos lifnei Rosh Hashanah. Shel Baal, here they translate based on the Rambam elsewhere. It's referring to onions also, but onions that do produce scallions. And you withheld the water from them 3 watering periods before Rosh Hashanah. Harei elu mipeiris shishis, they're considered to be 6th-year produce. Pachas mikanaren kisvichei shvius, less than that, they're considered to be growths of Shemitah. Yud ches hadluyin, calabash, type of gourd, type of squash. Shekimon lezera, which you left in the ground to extract their seeds. Im hukshu lifnei Rosh Hashanah v'nifslu milechal adam, if they hardened before the new year and they became disqualified from human consumption, muter lekaimon bashvius shein mipeiris shishis, you can leave it during Shemitah in the ground because they're really from fruits that are in the 6th year. But if not, asurin kisvichei shvius, they're forbidden. They're like growths of Shemitah, because since their purpose was to get the seeds, and they only finished their growth during Shemitah, so it's like Shemitah fruit. V'chein ha'yirakos kulan, shehukshu lifnei Rosh Hashanah, same thing with any other vegetable which hardened before Rosh Hashanah, muter lekaiman b'shvius, you can keep them during Shemitah. If they were soft, asur lekaiman mishum svichim, you cannot keep them on account of their being after growths. We don't obligate a person to uproot the luf, that's the taro. This is the taro. Or it's also alternatively translated as this berry, the Aram Palestinum. You must leave it in the ground as is. If it only grows after Shemitah, it's permitted. We don't obligate him to either uproot the artichoke plant, simply cut off its leaves. If it grows after Shemitah, you're in luck and you can eat those artichokes. Halacha yotes luf shel erev shvius. This stuff, the luf, that grew on the 6th year, the eve of Shemitah, v'chein betzalim shel erev shvius hakitzainim. Also summer onions, which grew this is summer onions, that grew in the year before Shemitah, upua. Pua is the madder root. It's used for red dye. Shenigmiru lifnei shvius, if they were ripened before Shemitah, muter la'akran b'shvius b'kardumes shel matches, you can uproot them during Shemitah with axes of metal. Ve'ein bazeh mishum avodas haaretz, it's not considered tilling or working the land, it's simply extracting these plants. Halacha chav habitzalim sheyardu aleim geshamim b'shvius v'tzamchu, onions upon which rain fell during Shemitah and they grew, because the onion bulb remains in the ground. even if you harvest what grows out of it. And here the onion bulb remained, and then rain came down, again, not by your intervention, and it grew. Kolzman sheha'olin shalahen yerukin, as long as the leaves are green at elu mutarin, they're permitted. Once they become dark, harein kinetuin ba'aretz, they're like planted in the ground. The oisan ha'olin asurin mishum svichim, and those leaves become forbidden as shvius aftergrowths. Either way, the onion bulbs themselves that are in the ground from before Shmittah are totally permitted as pre-Shmittah fruit. Halacha chaf aleph, batzel she'akre b'shvius, if you uprooted an onion bulb during Shmittah, unetay b'shminis, and you replanted it in the 8th year, v'rabu gidulav al ikrai, and the new growths are now more in quantity than its original size, helu gidulav es ikrai v'hutar hakol, the new growths nullify the core of it, and the whole thing is permitted. The same way Shmittah forbids through the land, the permission is also granted to the land through the new growths that are mevatel, that nullify the original bulb. Chav beis, haperes, we return now to the core rule of not cutting fruits in the proper normal way. Haperes sheyetzi ha'ilan b'shvius, any fruit that are produced by a tree on Shmittah, layasveim kederech she'osef b'chol shana, you should not gather them in as you would harvest them the rest of the year. Shenemar, because it says, Ves invein nezirecha lo'isivtzar, the grapes that should be separated by you, don't harvest. If you harvested fruit to help, to enhance the growth of the tree, or you simply harvested the fruit for the fruit, as normal harvesters do, leika, you get lashes. Instead, what should you do? Figs that grow in Shmittah, don't spread them out to dry like you usually do. You can dry them out in a ruin where nobody goes. You should not press grapes in a vat. Press them in a bowl. Don't press olives in an olive press. So you can crush them and put them in a very small press. You can also grind the olives in the major press, and then umachnis lebad ketana, and put it back into a smaller press for actual pressing. It's also allowed. Same thing in all other areas. Wherever you can make a change, make a change. Chav dalid mitzvah saseh. It's a positive commandment. Lahashmit kol ma shetoitzi haaretz b'shvius, for the person to actively relinquish that which his land produces during Shmittah. Shenemar, as it says, v'hashvius tishmitena unetashta. The Shmittah, you shall relinquish and you shall abandon it. Anybody who actively goes against that, locks his vineyard, fences his field in on Shmittah, bitul mitzvah saseh, has cancelled a positive commandment. Same thing, if you gather all your food into your house and nobody can get to it, you've transgressed a negative commandment. You must declare it ownerless, and everybody's hand is equal everywhere. For it says, the poor people in your nation shall eat. You can treat your own field as ownerless and bring in from your own field what you would normally bring in from an ownerless field, which is very little, a little at a time. 5 barrels of oil, 5 jugs of oil, 15 jugs of wine, a little more than that is also permitted. Ultimately, you're not treating the field like your own, you've left it ownerless. This halacha touches on a major analysis that the commentaries have when it comes to Shmittah. Is the obligation of relinquishment something which happens automatically, or you have to impose it on your field? Do you have to declare that the fruits are ownerless, or automatically by God's word they're considered ownerless? And there are many, many different ramifications about this. The Rambam seems to imply the first way, you have to actively do it. Yafkir hakoil. You must actively declare it hefker. Others have said that the Rambam holds that it's what's called afkaita de malka. The king revokes your ownership over it. It's God's automatic right, so to speak, overpowers your right to the land. Anyway, it's a big discussion, just to point that out. The whole Shmittah prohibition only applies in Israel. For it says, when you come into the land. But it applies whether or not the temple is standing. And we remember these maps. Twice the Jews came into Israel, first with Joshua, that's called Eli Mitzrayim, those that ascended from Egypt. They conquered much more to the north, to the south. And then, second time, when Ezra came up, they didn't conquer as much to the north, to the south. Says the Rambam, Kol she'achziku b'Eli Bavel ad Kziv. any part of Israel which was conquered by the Oilei Bavel, the second round, those that ascended from Babylon, all the way until Kziv, which is about here, Asur Ba'avoda, is under the laws of Shmittah. It's forbidden to be worked during that year. And all aftergrowths that grow during that year are forbidden to be eaten. But the areas of Israel which were only conquered the first time round, when the Jews came from Egypt, from Kziv all the way up to this way to the river, up to the mountains of Ammona, which is up here in the area of Lebanon, up north. Even though it's forbidden to work it on Shmittah, growths that grow there are permitted to be eaten. Further up from that area of Ammona, mutar ba'avodah b'shvius is totally permitted to work on Shmittah. Shmittah doesn't apply there at all. Syria, the area of Syria which King David conquered outside of Israel to the east, it has a quasi-Israel status in many areas. Even though biblically Shmittah does not apply there, the rabbis decreed it should be forbidden to work there, like Israel on Shmittah, to discourage Jews from leaving Israel and settling there. But the other areas right around Israel, Ammon and Moav and Egypt and Babylon, even though they are obligated in Meiser. Rabbinically, the obligation of tithings apply there. Ein Shvius Neheges Bahen. The laws of Shmittah don't apply there. Eived HaYarden, Transjordan. Shvius Neheges Bamidivreim. The rabbis impose Shmittah restrictions there. Usfiche Surya ve'Eived HaYarden. The growths of Shmittah from Syria and from Transjordan, Mutardin Ba'achila, are permitted to be eaten. We can't make these lands more stringent than Israel itself, which was only conquered in round one and doesn't have the prohibition of Sfichim. If a Gentile buys land in Israel and plants it on Shmittah, its fruits are permitted. The only reason the rabbis declared the prohibition on the growths is because of those Jewish sinners. The Gentiles don't have the laws of Shmittah for us to enact this decree upon them. So their fruit are permitted. Lamed Ayores Eretz Yisrael Asmuches Lasfar, cities in Israel that are close to the border, Moishivim Aleim Neman, we appoint a trustee over them, so that the Gentiles don't break in and grab and plunder all the Shemitah fruit. It's all ownerless stuff. You don't want to leave it to them. It's a fascinating story. It happened just the last Shemitah in Israel, where some people decided to keep the laws of Shemitah close to the border. They didn't plant their fields, and terrorists broke through a tunnel, thinking that all the fields are going to be full of growths and they'll be able to hide. Meanwhile, nothing was on the field, and they entered into an open space. They were immediately spotted, and the Jews were saved. So Shemitah, of course, keeping Hashem's mitzvahs ultimately brings blessings.